Hello and welcome back to A House Divided, coming to you live from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it's on our shelves, it's history. My name is Bjorn Skaptis and I'll be your host today. And today, A House Divided is coming to you live from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop's satellite annex in Logan Square neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois. It's Professor Bennett Parten. Professor Parten is a assistant professor of history at Georgia Southern University. His expertise is in the Civil War period. He was named a distinguished lecturer by the Organization of American Historians. He's a native of Royston, Georgia, completed his PhD at Yale. We'll probably talk about that. Has written a lot of great stuff, and we're going to talk to Bennett in just a moment. But thank you for joining us, Bennett.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Hey, the book we're going to talk about today is Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. It comes to us from Simon & Schuster, and we thank Simon & Schuster for helping get Professor Parton on the show with us today. So welcome to the show, Ben. Thank you so much for setting aside time to talk with us today.
No, absolutely. Very excited to be here, and really excited to see where this conversation goes.
Great, great. Well, I think let's go ahead and start with the book. I will be occasionally checking on our live stream, which is going fine. Thank you. All right, let's talk about Somewhere Toward Freedom. Somewhere Toward Freedom is a book about Sherman's March, but it's not really about Sherman's March, is it? Um, tell us how you got the idea about writing a book about this march.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I've never heard it put that way, but I really really enjoy that. So as I've been telling folks, this book has maybe two origin stories. One has to do with the fact that I grew up in Georgia. I was born and raised in Royston, Georgia, which is a little bit north of Athens. And once, twice, maybe three or four times a year, my family would drive down to the coast, here where I live in Savannah now, Jekyll Island to the south, Hilton Head, Port Royal to the north, and other spots along the low country. And for all of maybe the first 30 minutes of that drive, you are essentially on Sherman's path through Georgia. Um, Coincidentally, now that's the exact same route that I take when I go home from Savannah to visit my parents, and then when we go visit my wife's family in Atlanta. We take a similar route that passes us, right through one of the many routes that Sherman took through Georgia. And then two, when we got to the coast here, as much as I enjoyed sitting on the beach, what I really like to do is drive and explore. I really fell in love with the Low Country, and I think this book really started in some respects with those memories I have as a kid. And certainly when I sat down to think about history, there was a part of me that relished writing history of two places that mean so much to me, being the state of Georgia, my home state, but also just the Low Country and the islands there on the coast. But then the short answer to how this book got started has to do with work of fiction. Some of your listeners probably know Yale Doctorow, might be familiar with his fictional book called The March. If you don't know Doctorow, Doctorow to me is one of the great historical fiction writers we've had. He's probably best known for Ragtime, which is a great look at America at the turn of the 20th century. But he also tried his hand at writing about the March in a book he called simply The March. And as Doctorow had a habit of doing, he included in his story an almost kaleidoscopic cast of characters. There is a troubled U.S. Army surgeon. There's a Southern debutante who becomes the surgeon's sidekick and love interest, and it's kind of complicated. Even Sherman himself appears as a character, and there are many others. But Doctorow also included as a character in his story a freedwoman named Wilma Jones, who drops everything, runs to the army, and then travels with the army all the way to Savannah. Uh, and so when I read this, I immediately began to think that Jones is likely not a singular character, that she's likely a composite character. There's probably many hundreds, if not thousands, of Wilma Joneses who experienced the march. So I immediately began to think about how we could tell the story of Jones and folks like her, not from a perspective of historical fiction, but from a perspective of history. And in some ways, I think really this book began with me trying to write the kind of nonfiction handbook or companion piece to Yale Doctorow's The March.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And what that story I've read The March, and I'm a big fan of that book and of E.L. Doctorow. It also evokes for me, I know I love that character, but it also evokes for me, I immediately think of the first few pages, the
Uh,
introduction of that book, the first few pages, where if I'm not wrong, he paints a picture of the plantation and the people there, the enslaved people there sense something coming in the breeze. You can't actually
mhm.
see it yet, and they're up and they're going and they're getting ready to leave, and then the army comes marching by and they follow it.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and that's almost like it's got kind of a Grapes of Wrath feel in the way he
Mhm.
describes the scene, sets up the scene, and then they head off toward, whatever mystery future that they're after. And something about your book reminded me of that. In hearing you say that that you were inspired by Dr. O, well, it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, everything about the Doctor book, and I can remember those pages that you're talking about, is an incredible example of being able to set a scene, and
Mhm.
really kind of describe what it might have been like to be there, the landscape, the environment, everything. And again, as a native Georgian and having made this trip, I can kind of see the landscape, as I was writing this, and I can sort of almost, make that drive now with my eyes closed,
Yeah.
and can really identify, how you move from, middle Georgia, the rolling hills to the coastal plain to then, near Savannah, you're outside, and truly the low country and, the land of standing water and cypress trees,
Yeah.
And so as I said, I was incredibly inspired by Dr. O's book and really tried to kind of channel, I don't want to say my inner Dr. O, but
Mhm.
really tried to, kind of imitate what he had done here in his book, The March. And I should say I was able to do so in part because I was astounded to learn just how big of a movement this was.
Mhm.
Yes, I knew they would likely be more Wilma Joneses, but what really I think indicated to me that this might be a bigger story than I realized was when I discovered that Sherman speculates when he arrives in Savannah, there may be as many as 20,000 freed refugees, folks just like Wilma Jones,
Mhm.
that had arrived with his army outside of Savannah. And that is an astounding figure.
That's
Savannah
a third of
itself
his
only had
army. That's a
it's a
third
third
the
of his
size of his
army.
army. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And it's 2,000 people less than Savannah's overall population in 1860, which is astounding to think about. It's Georgia's biggest city. It's
Mhm.
double the size of Atlanta in 1860. So we're talking about a refugee movement that follows behind his army the size of a large southern city. And that doesn't take into account the folks who might have run to the army and then were turned back or turned back on their own volition. Doesn't count the folks who might have run to the army and then decided not to follow the army. It doesn't take into account the folks who experience freedom as a consequence of this campaign, and that's where the subtitle comes in. My contention is that when you take all these different factors combined, what you have is, one of the great military campaigns of the Civil War, but also the largest emancipation event in American history.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into that question because there are fine books about Sherman's March. There is a long fantasy history about
Mhm.
Sherman's March
Sure.
that a lot of us had to grow up. But there are fine books about Sherman's March. I would recommend, as a general history, military history, somebody read Noah Andre Trudeau's.
Mhm.
I don't have it in front of me, so it slips my mind. But Southern Storm,
Southern Storm. That's right.
Southern
Yeah, no,
Storm,
that's a talking about other
and
books that were really important to me. I mean, his book was, I mean, like Doctor O, hugely important for me.
right,
Also
and
very important for
yeah, go well. The point I would make is it does make a wonderful counter to what you've done because I think Trudeau wrote a book that is one of the best books about Sherman's March as a military campaign from the point of view of a military campaign.
Mhm.
And so what you've done is write about the same thing from the point of view of the refugees, from the point of
Mhm.
view of the freedom seekers, and so on and so forth. So, and while Trudeau does a great job of bringing in those people when they affect the military, he doesn't write about them. He writes about
Hmm.
Sherman and the soldiers and Howard and Slocum and Sherman. And if there's any fighting to be done, he writes about that. That's why there's room for this story. And that's why I was so excited to hear it and to read about it. But tell me, I want to get to a question.
Yeah, sure.
So tell me about, because I am recommending your book. They should buy
That's
Andy's book
right.
too,
That's
but I
right.
am recommending
That's right.
they buy your book. Um, the but how you did face a challenge, you had to face a challenge writing a war book about something that's not war, about something
Right.
that is also that's not traditionally a part of military history.
Right.
Tell us about any challenges that you came up with when looking at telling a war story from that point of view, from the others.
Yeah, well, that's a really great question, and I think one way to answer it is that it was a bit of a challenge, and writing about the refugees just in general was a challenge. I mean, enslaved people generally leave, a few amount of sources, and then enslaved people who are refugees who are on the move, as folks might appreciate, would leave even fewer, and so there was always a question of source material, and how can I could tell these stories. But actually, I was able to do it in part because armies are giant bureaucracies that leave, just reams of reports and other forms of paperwork. And in these stories, you can find kernels of stories, bits and pieces, enough to really begin painting a larger picture embedded in some of these military records. Sometimes you had to get a little bit creative. You had to sort of read against the grain. Sometimes you wish they would have tell you more. But within that kind of classic military history and the sort of the real-time recording of the march by the Army, you can find these stories. And then another really important source collection for me were just the soldiers themselves. They were very aware that they were taking part in a march that would change the order of history, that to them was almost Napoleonic in its scale. And so after the fact, they wrote about their experiences. And one of the things that made this march so unique for them was their interactions with enslaved people. And within these narratives, these reminiscences, these memoirs, you could again glean stories of enslaved people and tell this other narrative that we don't often see. And here, not to sidetrack us back to Southern Storm, but someone like Trudeau was so important to me because he did such a fantastic job writing military history. And then in his notes, actually, he organized them based on units in order of battle, which to me was super helpful because it laid out really a template for sources to use and also where they were, how they were organized, which when it came to doing this research was really, really useful. And so from a basic just sort of method perspective, yes, this is kind of a counterpart to classic military history, but I couldn't have done it without those classic components of military reports, folks like Trudeau, the soldiers themselves. And I think I've also benefited from the fact that as the historiography has evolved, as the writing of the Civil War has evolved, more and more writers, I think, have become aware of just how enmeshed the story of emancipation is with the military experience and how enslaved people in the army in places like Georgia and places like the Mississippi Valley um, really sort of existed in a kind of push and pull relationship. Enslaved
Mhm.
people pushed the army to accept emancipation. The army, in some ways, kind of validated that experience, welcomed them to the lines. And so it was a kind of reciprocal relationship wherever the army went in the Civil War. Usually, we can talk about maybe some exceptions and how things get complicated as well.
Sure. Sure. Well, yeah, I think I was going to move on to a question that's similar to that. So let's keep that thread going because I think one of the things when we see about northern white soldiers campaigning in the South is we're constantly reminded that these people did not join the army to be abolitionists. These people
Hmm.
did not had a 19th century white man's view of African
Hmm.
Americans, and these people usually accepted as established fact that enslavement was a way the world was.
Hmm.
And so when they write things and we read them, they don't appear, they appear to be more like Confederate soldiers than the
Hmm.
people who stand to get freed by this war. Yet, as soon as they encounter slavery, these guys seem to change.
Yeah.
These guys seem, in fact, they become some of the most zealous emancipators. Without becoming some sort of abolitionist, they become the most zealous emancipators. And there have been some good books about that as well. Did you find that among the soldiers, the enlisted Union soldiers in this book?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's always a range of reactions, right?
Hmm.
And it really runs the gamut in terms of how many of these soldiers reacted to enslaved people when they arrived in Georgia. As you said, many of them carry their own prejudices, their own biases. Some of them shed that as they move through Georgia, some of them don't. And you see that all along the lines of the march. Some refugees are welcomed in, some are turned away, some for practical reasons they're turned away, some for reasons having to do with the prejudice of the soldiers themselves. But I think you are right that as this march unfolds, many of the soldiers become perhaps not abolitionists, but are much more welcoming of enslaved people, in part because they are made to realize that enslaved people are their allies. One of the key features of the march is that at every stop along the way, enslaved people were there and were always helping the army. Another podcast host that I was lucky enough to do an interview with described them as Sherman's fifth column. Sherman had four columns through Georgia, and enslaved people acted as their fifth columns, were playing up, in the I guess the trope of the fifth column. And I think that's
Yeah.
absolutely right. There are incredible stories of enslaved people acting as intelligence officers, as scouts, as lookouts. Sherman often asked for enslaved people to get a read on where Confederate cavalry was.
Hmm.
There's stories of enslaved people telling soldiers not to go to certain houses because those were barricaded and that people were ready for them, right? And even the best stories are those of how enslaved people pointed the army to where forage was.
Hmm.
Southern whites often hid their goods, hid their horses out in the woods, their family heirlooms out in this family cemetery and buried them.
Hmm.
But of course, they didn't actually do this. They forced enslaved people to do it for them.
Yeah.
And so when Sherman's army arrived on the plantations, many enslaved people used this knowledge to point the soldiers to exactly where these things had been hidden, and then sometimes use them as a bargaining chip to go along with the march.
Yeah.
So this is just one example of many of how enslaved people really acted as a force in and of themselves in this story, and all through the march, really helped the soldiers, helped the army, and were active participants in this story. And I think it's this realization that helped many of Sherman's men to realize the fruits of freedom and to really, I think, change their tune when it came to thinking of this war as a moment of liberation.
Right. And I think one other thing that every single soldier was going to write about and every single veteran was going to remember was who treated prisoners of war and
Mhm.
escapees and how did they treat them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the stories of the march is
Mhm.
that as soon as Sherman begins moving through Georgia, his lines will regularly find escaped prisoners of war arriving back at his lines, often in the company of an enslaved person who
Mhm.
had hidden this prisoner, in the woods, who had traveled great distances just to get to Sherman's army. And oftentimes, that soldier that arrived, the former prisoner of war, would vouch for the enslaved person's acceptance into the line to be able to travel along with the army.
Yeah.
And so that's a really powerful story that unfolds here in Georgia.
Mhm. Now, speaking of bias and prejudice, let's discuss William Tecumseh Sherman
Sure.
and and uh, and how he plays a part in this. Um, I'm sure I would not be the first person to call Old Comp Sherman a reluctant emancipator,
That's
uh,
right.
but still an effective one. Am I right about that?
That's right. Yeah, and his position here and his thoughts on what's unfolding along his march is nothing if not complicated. And how he views emancipation is the same. It's nothing if not complicated. Certainly, he starts the war as someone who doesn't see slavery as having a central place in it, doesn't view it as important. And he's someone who resists the evolution of the war to one that will make ending slavery a significant war aim. He's always reluctant. He's always resistant of this. That being said, by the time the march happens, he is beginning to slowly evolve his thinking, slowly evolve his position. Granted, he's not doing so very fast, but he is beginning to evolve a little bit. He now, for example, sees slavery as being a real target of his army, and he believes that targeting slavery is a way to end the war. He sees it as a real war measure here. Uh, and he also, I think, is beginning to realize that casting himself as a liberator, even a reluctant one, is good for him politically. And so he is slowly beginning to, I think, face up to this evolution and slowly beginning to accept it.
Mhm.
But what's really interesting about him and George is he had no, I think, expectation that the march would unfold in this manner, at least in terms of its scale. He had fought in the South before, he'd been in Georgia before. He knew that enslaved people were likely to come to his lines, but it's the scale of the movement to his lines is something that I don't think he quite expected. And just as maybe an example of that, he issues, as part of his official campaign orders, a refugee policy of sorts, in which he says that enslaved people who come to his army's lines may be taken along if they are able-bodied, meaning can work and fend for themselves, but that it's the officer's first duty to see to their own soldiers and then the movement of the army itself. And I may be paraphrasing there just a little
Mhm.
bit. And this order is interesting to me because it's incredibly ambiguous. It doesn't actually give his men any, real directive here. It also reflects Sherman's own view that emancipation should always be contingent on labor and the kind of labor that enslaved people can provide his army. This is something that is a through line for Sherman going all the way back to really when the war begins, but especially in Memphis when he's the military governor in 1862. But I think it's also born of a certain conceit and this assumption that Sherman and the army will be able to control this movement and control emancipation as the army moves. And one of the things that becomes very clear, especially by Milledgeville, which is about the halfway point of the march, is that that is in fact not the case, that enslaved people are going to run to his army, that they are going to have a real stake in this march, whether he likes that and whether he planned that or not.
Mhm. Um, yeah, and so he's going to be a very interesting character in this. We could probably go on and on if we brought in the he. Fortunately for us, both him and his brother John Sherman wrote a
Mhm.
lot to each other and in public about what they thought about the Civil War, including in some cases the slavery and emancipation, and that might be for another book sometime.
Yeah.
But in this book, it does reveal a lot about an evolution in
Mhm.
Sherman's thinking, and he's a good example, I think, of someone who uh, who succeeds in emancipating people without surrendering his prejudices toward them
Mhm.
necessarily. Um, but he gets to Savannah,
That's
um,
right.
and and we do establish, your book establishes that this is the largest emancipation event. So 20,000 people have followed Sherman to Savannah, and now they're free. Uh, Now would be a great time to end the story and say congratulations and raha, yoo-hoo, we won. The old US of A won that one. Unfortunately, Ben, you took the story a little further and asked yourself what happened to these people during the march and uh, what happened when they got there. And I think while this happened many times on the march, and Trudeau covers it, but the first thing that we need to talk about is the Ebenezer Creek
Mhm.
situation, uh, where where uh, where these folks found themselves cut off. And so tell
Mhm.
us a little bit about that. And we'll take the Army into Savannah, but I don't think we can get to Savannah without acknowledging the disaster that happened before they got there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Ebenezer Creek is the bleakest, most tragic episode in this story. I think that's pretty clear, pretty easy to say. It happens in large part because of one of Sherman's subordinates, a man named Jeff C. Davis, who I want to specify is not Jeff F. Davis, the Confederate president. These are two very different people. They're
Mhm.
both rather infamous, I think you could say.
Yeah.
Uh, Davis is one of Sherman's subordinates. He is the head of the 14th Corps. which is one of the four columns marching through Georgia. Sherman divided his army into two wings, a left and a right wing, and within both of those wings, there are two corps. And Davis is in the left wing, and not only is he in the left wing, his column is farthest left. And so it is the one that marches closest to the Savannah River, which is important because it means that he crosses the swampiest, most difficult terrain. As he begins to approach Savannah, he really gets into the low country, to the rice swamps and rice fields north of Savannah. And Davis is someone who does not like the fact that so many refugees are following his army. From my research, he's the only one that writes Sherman directly about this. He wants to do something to basically remove them from his lines. And I never found any sort of response for Sherman or anything like that. But nonetheless, Davis's method of doing this is to essentially pull up bridges, temporary pontoon bridges that allow his army to cross rivers before the refugees have a chance to cross themselves, who are following behind his army. He does this once, twice, maybe three times before arriving at Ebenezer Creek. But Ebenezer Creek is where disaster strikes. And I should just maybe set the scene here for a little bit. It's called Ebenezer Creek, but this is a body of water that's about 20 miles north of Savannah. It is a creek in name, but it is really a kind of bayou. You know, from being from Savannah, these are very familiar to me. It's these kind of classic intercoastal waterways. For much of the year, especially in December when this would have happened, it's essentially a cypress swamp. Heavy rains can raise the water level pretty high. And then the crossing itself is pretty close to where the creek runs into the Savannah River. So there is a pretty heavy current that is running through this water. So it's a little bit more than a traditional creek. It's a much bigger body of water. But nonetheless, Davis pulls up the bridges before the refugees have a chance to cross. Some sources suggest that he actually burns the bridge for good measure. And when he does so, Joseph Wheeler's Confederate cavalry barrels up from behind and charges into the refugees. Many of the men and women who are stranded plunge into the water to try to make it across. Many do not actually make it, and that is very clear in the days ahead. And those who did make it into the water were likely either killed and captured and re-enslaved, are killed or captured and re-enslaved by Wheeler's men. This becomes really a bleak, dark moment along the march. And it becomes a real turning point. Many of the refugees who might have wanted to turn back can't turn back because doing so means trying to cross the creek, heading right back into Confederate cavalry. Many of them, the soldiers are right. It's very clear that had lost family members, children, mothers, fathers, loved ones. And then for the soldiers, it also becomes a real turning point because, to your question earlier, this is when many of them begin to realize the extraordinary lengths that enslaved people were willing to go to pursue freedom. This is something that becomes very clear to them. And many of them become quite angry at Davis for his heavy-handed, which is
It's a light way to put it.
understates it. Yeah, light way to put it. His really nefarious actions here in Georgia. So many of them become incredibly incensed at Davis. So Ebenezer Creek is really the darkest, bleakest, most tragic moment here along the march.
Right, right. But let me stop the discussion here for a moment because I want to invite the folks who are watching. You're going to see me looking down every once in a while. I'm kind of monitoring the feed. I want to invite everybody to ask your own questions. If you want to put your questions in the comments underneath this feed, please do. I'm looking at the feed, and if you want to ask questions of Ben, you can do it. I would love to dominate the entire hour, but this is for you. And so if you want to ask questions, please do. But Ben, we have gotten the Army, we've gotten Sherman and the Army to Savannah. And this is where, and certainly the 20,000 make it there with him. And so now he's got this other problem and they've got this other problem. Now they've arrived. And there are more of them than there are people in the city. What are the challenges that the city and Sherman and other authorities are facing now that they're here?
Well, the biggest challenge that Sherman is facing is twofold, I think. One is that news of Ebenezer Creek eventually gets out. Many of those soldiers who heard about it, who might have witnessed it, it's unclear how exactly, but they likely wrote home, wrote their congressman. That's something I've seen referenced in some of the sources. And so Sherman, despite waltzing into Savannah as a conquering hero, he also is beginning to receive some letters letting him know that there is also a counter narrative about how he could have freed more people, and that how his army, symbolized by Davis's nefarious actions there at Ebenezer Creek, really treated enslaved people unjustly. And so this is becoming a bit of a problem for Sherman. It's an issue that he doesn't want to deal with, but nonetheless he's going to have to deal with. And the other is just simply the fact that he's not going to be in Savannah forever. He is going to turn north and march through the Carolinas eventually. And having that many refugees with his army is something that he does not want to continue through the Carolinas, in part because when he arrives in Savannah, that number only grows. Enslaved people from the counties along the coast begin marching to the army from the south. So that's going to add to the numbers there. And then he's well aware of the fact that as he enters into the Carolinas, that number is only going to grow as well. And in fact, what he encounters in Carolina, the two Carolinas, might be even bigger than what's happened here in Georgia. And so he knows that something has to be done. And so one of the things that he decides to do is begin transporting the refugees down the Ogeechee River, which is really the waterway that is most important to him. This is about maybe probably less than 10 miles south of Savannah. It's another one of those classic intercoastal waterways.
Mhm.
But Sherman uses it as a depot, and he uses it as an access point to access the Atlantic Ocean. And this is important because he uses the Ogeechee to begin transporting the refugees down the Ogeechee into the Atlantic and then up the coast to the islands around Port Royal, South Carolina, and the town of Beaufort. And this is important because there, since 1861, or excuse me, the spring of 1862, had been the site of an ongoing freedmen's colony, a place where there were Northern missionaries, charity workers, humanitarian workers, Northern agents, school teachers who were there, essentially trying to start the transition from slavery to freedom. It's known as the Port Royal experiment. And so Sherman thinks that this is a place for him to begin sending the refugees. And he does, beginning right before Christmas in 1864.
Then, yeah, so he decides to move them away. Well, let's stay in Savannah for a moment. And if I get the timeline wrong about this, remind me about it. But when he's in Savannah, he ends up uh, having a visit from Edwin Stanton,
That's right.
which I think is a disappointing visit for Sherman. And also a really interesting part of your book is when he gets together in the house of Charles Green with
That's
some
right.
locals. I don't know if this happens when he still has the refugees there or when he's moving them to Port Royal, but I'd like to hear a little bit about that, about the Charles Green meeting.
Yeah, so it happens happens in January 12th of 1865.
Okay.
And so Sherman has already begun the process of transporting the refugees up to Port Royal. But you're absolutely right. Stanton arrives, I think, on New Year's in 1865, January 1st, January 2nd, something like that. And he is there ostensibly to requisition some cotton that's left in the city. But it becomes very clear to Sherman that he's also there to figure out what happened along the march. At one point, he being Stanton, pulls out a newspaper alleging the crimes of Ebenezer Creek. He points to it and asks Sherman for answers. And
Mm.
Sherman kind of plays it off and says, "Go talk to Davis. Like he's the one that saw it. He's the one that did it. He's the one that will give you
Uh-huh.
the answers." And this is not quite enough for Stanton. What he wants to do instead is have a meeting with 20 of Savannah's Black religious leaders to really get to the bottom of how they viewed the march and also talk through what to do about this refugee movement of people here in Savannah and the refugees that had followed Sherman's army on the coast. Sherman is already beginning the process of transporting them, but nonetheless, Stanton wants a better answer than that. He wants a better policy and a more sort of permanent solution here. And it's really a remarkable moment As you said, it takes place in the house of Charles Green, who was a British-born cotton merchant. If anybody's been to Savannah, this is one of the mansions on Madison Square. Uh, and as I said, Stanton and Sherman have this meeting with 20 of Savannah's black religious leaders, but the leaders appoint a man named Garrison Frazier to act as their spokesman. And Frazier is someone who had bought his freedom 10 years earlier, as well as his wife's freedom, and had been a pastor ever since. And in this moment, he really holds court with two of the most powerful men in the country. And the meeting, as I said, is ostensibly about the Georgia freedmen. That's how it's described in the source material. Uh, but Stanton asks him questions in a way that the meeting becomes essentially an exploration about what the war meant to enslaved people and what they expected emancipation to bring. And one of Fraser's answers is land, that he thinks the best way for the refugees and enslaved people more broadly to have success in freedom is to be able to acquire land, to settle it, and to enjoy the independence that comes with it. There's also a critical moment, and this is one of those sort of wonderful nuggets of history that sometimes you
Mhm.
find, where Stanton asks Fraser, "Well, how have you come by your opinions?" And Fraser looks at him and says, "Well, in the course of talking with my peers, but also in the course of my ministry to the refugees,
Mhm.
whose numbers surpass even my own expectation." And this is a small admission, I suppose,
Mhm.
sort of an off the hand remark, but I think it's really remarkable because it suggests that despite not actually being in the room physically, the
Mhm.
refugees, nonetheless, by their sheer movement behind Sherman's army, their collective action, nonetheless found a way to have their own thoughts and visions and dreams represented here in this meeting with these two powerful individuals. And it's going to end up really altering, I would argue, the scope of what Reconstruction is going to look like,
Yeah,
or could look like, I
so
should
they have
say.
a voice in the room, but from the point of view of a historian, it validates some primary source opportunities. You kind of figure these people think this way, and you find evidence that well, that now they have a mouthpiece, and he
Exactly.
tells
Yeah, yeah.
you what they told him they thought.
Exactly. Yeah, we don't always have a lot to go on sometimes as historians, especially working in
Mhm.
this period with some of these sources. But I think when you can find like a nugget like that or an opening like that, I think it can be a really powerful window to extrapolate. And it can be confirmation that the things that we assume people might think or believe, do in fact exist, right? That is,
Mhm.
real evidence for some of the inferences we make sometimes. And so that can be a really exciting moment when you're, in the archive or you're doing research.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, we had already moved. We were moving down the Ogeechee before. But this brings us to the Port Royal experiment, and before I let you jump into that, I'm gonna shout out uh, to one of the really great things that's happened in public history, in the field of public history, in the last few years. And I say this proudly as a one-time member of the National Park Service, that recently the Reconstruction National Park did open in Beaufort,
That's
South
right.
Carolina. And just like you can go to the battlefields and see the Civil War interpreted on the battlefield, and I worked at a Civil War battlefield, uh, you can now this is recent. Americans can now go to a Reconstruction National Park and learn about everything from the Port Royal experiment all the way through to the more formal aspects of Reconstruction. If you go to South Carolina and if you visit the Low Country, you can visit the places where these things happened. And to bring us back around to the book, what we're going to talk about with these refugees, you can go visit the same way you visit a battlefield. You can visit the place where these refugees had this experience. So Americans visit your national parks and visit that, and you have that opportunity the same way you can visit a battlefield. You have an opportunity to visit a place to learn about Reconstruction and the same story that Ben is writing about in the back half of this book. So yeah, bring us to the Port Royal experiment and what's happening at St. Helena Island and Beaufort and all
Yeah.
around the Sound.
Yeah, so as I said, the Port Royal experiment is a really important part of in the history of the Civil War. And I'm glad you gave a shout out to the Reconstruction site. It's a great site. It's really important. I would just second everything you said about visiting it. It's a really remarkable place. But it is a project that, as I said, began in 1862, in part because earlier in the fall of 1861, the U.S. Navy sailed into Port Royal Sound. In part because Port Royal Sound is the deepest deep water port on the southern coastline. And so it was an excellent place situated between Charleston and Savannah for the U.S. Navy to kind of blockade both and still have a depot and a base of supplies, so to speak. But what happens when the Navy sails into the Sound and fires off its guns onto the meager defenses on either side is it forces the region's white inhabitants to flee. And when they do, they leave behind roughly 10,000 enslaved people there on the islands who are effectively free. But at that moment, the U.S. government does not define them as such. Instead, they're defined as contraband, Southern property to be requisitioned. But nonetheless, Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, a real abolitionist, he views this as an opportunity to begin slowly evolving the war towards one that will ultimately end slavery. And so what he proposes is a plan whereby these teams of missionaries, agents, humanitarians, teachers, pastors, plantation technocrats, these middle manager types, they would all come to the islands, administer aid, build schools, hold religious services, but also very critically, coerce, convince enslaved people to go back to the plantations, working in cotton, not as enslaved people, but as free people working for a wage. And so the Port Royal experiment, again, beginning in 1862, is this really important moment that is an early rehearsal, as one historian has described it, for Reconstruction, and a really early rehearsal for this shift from slave to free labor and slavery to freedom in the South more broadly. It's a really complicated story. There's
Mhm.
been some great writing about it. There's a lot more that can be said. But it matters for us in this story because as Sherman begins to send the refugees there after he arrives in Savannah, it really turns Port Royal into the site of a refugee crisis. The amount of refugees who arrive there double the amount of people that are there previously. Add that with the amount of military personnel, part of Sherman's army that's going to be there, and you really get a real massive humanity there on the islands. And that matters because eventually there's going to be a lack of resources, there's going to be a lack of shelter, there's going to be a lack of food. And so Port Royal, what was previously a self-contained freedmen's colony operating there on the southern coastline, becomes the epicenter of a sprawling refugee crisis, which is again where this story begins to take another bleak and tragic
Mhm.
turn.
Yeah, and yeah, indeed, the folks behind the Port Royal experiment weren't exactly consulted when Sherman decided to send the people there, and it sort of reinforces our view of Sherman as the reluctant emancipator. He'll emancipate the people if it gets them out of his hair.
Yeah. Yeah, it should be said that that was always Sherman's view. He viewed this as really an expedient and something that was good for him and his own army. And he made certain humanitarian claims that it was better for them to go to Port Royal where there was a certain infrastructure than behind
Mhm.
his lines. But certainly his own army's success and their speed was at front of mind here. And some of the folks at Port Royal were actually consulted. Sherman writes Rufus Saxon,
Okay.
the military governor there. Actually, it's a very brief conversation, and Saxon tells him not to send them there. That he
Mhm.
simply doesn't have the resources. And Sherman says, "Well, I can understand that, but nonetheless, it happens anyway." And so Saxton, almost immediately around Christmas, when the first transports begin arriving, he is really scrambling to try to find the adequate resources for the amount of people who are coming to his lines.
Right, right. Well, this brings us to certainly a new episode of Sherman's March starts, and he's going to go all the way up through the Low Country and into North Carolina until he ends the war. And I know he'll continue to, he and his army will continue to meet refugees and people seeking freedom all the way along the way.
Mhm.
Uh, but uh, but then finally we get to the end of the war, and Sherman issues some war orders,
Mhm.
that seem to anticipate Reconstruction and
Mhm.
what would happen then. And some of that reflecting back on things he may have heard at the Green
Yeah.
Mansion meeting, and it leading us to the whole 40 acres and a mule
Mhm.
sort of thing. Does do these chapters play much of a role in your book, or is that kind of a postscript?
No, they play a really important role in the book. It's really the second half of the book, and
Mm,
the final chapter is really about what happens to the refugees as the army begins marching through South Carolina. And this
mm,
Special Field Order Number 15, the 40 Acres and a Mule story, is important because that is all unfolding right there along Port Royal, and many of the refugees are part of this.
mm.
And so it is the kind of bookend to the book is this 40 Acres and a Mule story, the story of Special Orders Number 15. And that gets back a little bit to the story I told about the refugees in the meeting at the Green Mansion. Um, it is the special field orders is a direct consequence of these conversations that were had in the Green Mansion. And because the special field orders were put into place, they were ultimately unfulfilled. It is something that will turn tragic in the end. But nonetheless, what it does is it opens up the possibility of a much more meaningful and wider Reconstruction. Suddenly now, land reform is on the table. People begin to interpret it as such. And so Reconstruction takes on a whole new meaning in these moments. And if you follow the sort of breadcrumbs of the book, you can trace it all the way back to the fact that the refugees followed the army as they did, found a way to have a presence in that meeting, and then through, again, their movements, went on to force Sherman to give these orders, which would go on to change kind of the scope, early scope at least, of Reconstruction. So that's
Mhm.
part of the kind of argument that I'm trying to make here in the story. But you're
If I
absolutely right.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead and finish your thought, please.
Well, I was going to say you're absolutely right. Sherman turns north. He goes through South Carolina, North Carolina. And even when he arrives in May and late May in DC for the Grand Review of the Armies, there are refugees that are following his
Okay.
army. And this is one of the things that many of the spectators notice about his army that makes him very different from the army from Virginia. Not only are they wearing dirtier clothes, they've got longer beards, their buttons don't shine as well.
Lots of mascots.
Uh, yeah, lots of
All their
pets, lots
animals are
of
running
all the
around. Yeah.
animals are coming with them. But enslaved people are also with them. And the book ends with a comment from Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain,
Mhm.
seeing this and being sort of in awe of the fact that this is what's happening. And he has a moment where he realizes that, I would argue that this is what the war ultimately was about and where the war's ultimate legacy lies.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a grand army. It really was, that particular
Mhm.
one. Have you found any evidence as you continue to look at Sherman that whether or not he stood by the land reform idea it was once he was no longer part of the conversation?
No, he did not. In fact, he was very clear to specify that he only offered temporary
Mhm.
possessions, or what he called possessory titles. That's what he referred to it as for the
Possessory
land,
titles.
not full legal title. And so he was very clear about this. Though Stanton and Saxton and Olive Otis Howard, one of Sherman's subordinates who later
Hmm.
becomes the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, Howard perhaps less so. I mean, he is responsible and he's there turning land back over to the Confederates, though he's doing this somewhat begrudgingly. But those three become a kind of cabal who do everything they can to try to stall the restoration of Confederate property on the coast.
Hmm. Well, people need to read this book, Somewhere Toward Freedom. We're going to get back to that in a moment. But one of the aspects that's outside of the storytelling about this book is Somewhere Toward Freedom. It is published by Simon and Schuster, and I know a lot of our customers, a lot of our fans, look at a book and they think it's a book. One book is like another book, but authors and historians and people in the book trade see a distinction between books that are written for the academic press and books that are written for the popular press. And there are some practical differences because popular press books get read. Academic press books don't often get read, even though they tell great stories. But Ben, you've written this book and you've written it for Simon and Schuster, a trade press, and it tells a really great narrative story, yet it is original history from a college professor, from an historian. So give us a little inside baseball. Why did you decide, because this had to go back from the time you started writing this manuscript, that you wanted
That's
to
right.
tell a story that a lot of people would read. Uh, tell us about the thinking behind that.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to be able to really reach as wide an audience as possible. That's something that I believe in. Folks in my profession love to talk about public history, making history public, and there's lots of ways to do that. But I
Mm.
think the best way to do it is just to write a book that the public reads, and to reach people that way. So I think it's really important. I think it's something that we as historians and academic historians, professors, I think it's something that is really incumbent upon us to do. I think it's really important for us to do. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this. But I also wanted to tell a story in this kind of classic narrative form, in part because I was inspired by Doctorow, by Trudeau, and some of these folks, and I knew that this was a story of real movement, of a massive wave of humanity moving very quickly through the state of Georgia. And I also knew too that the refugee experience was so varied. There were so many people. There were so many side stories to tell that if I had a kind of rote myopia of what I wanted to talk about, I wouldn't be able to cover it all. And so to really do the refugee experience and really capture the experience of the refugees, as well as this march, I kind of knew that I had to write in a narrative fashion just to be able to encompass it all. And when I look back now, there are opportunities like where I feel like I could have done more of that and maybe been more sweeping in how the book reads. In fact, I think it could be a little bit longer. There are things that I wish maybe I would have said differently, but it happens, I
Yeah.
suppose. Um, but no, I think it was both just a matter of feeling very deeply that it's important for us to be reaching as wide an audience as possible, to be able to share these stories as widely as we can. But also, I felt like a real sort of earnest sense of duty to tell this story in a way that encompasses many voices as possible.
Yeah. And if some graduate student wants to pick up a quantitative analysis of the refugee crisis, that subject is still open.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, there's more to be said. It's a opening chapter rather than a final chapter, I hope.
Now, you studied with David Blight. Am I right about that?
That's right. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
correct.
And David Blight certainly has a deep interest in combining literary history with good history,
Hmm.
with first-class historical writing. He wrote American Oracle a few years ago, where he looked at literature about the Civil War and the Civil Rights era. So Professor Blight has always looked at history as storytelling, but with a high bar of truth to
Hmm.
reach. Um, so, do you kind of feel like you'd like to write stuff that fits into that tradition? Is that something that you like to read and write about?
Oh, for sure, absolutely. And just to say that David often assigns the doctoral book in his class, right, which I think
Mhm.
speaks to how important. It's not a work of classic history; it is a work of fiction, but nonetheless, I think it speaks to how he views the importance of literature and sometimes storytelling, right, and to be able to relate the experience of the past. And no, I see. Would be incredibly gratified to know that I could, sort of fall into that vein with someone like David. But no, I think it's absolutely important to really ground any sort of history we're telling in storytelling. I mean, it's been around for a while. The story, the
Yep.
narrative form. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. It's universal in a
The Greeks
sense.
invented a pretty good wheel when they
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so I think it's hugely important, and I absolutely would love to be in that vein. And David's a great example of that. His Douglas book is phenomenal. It does a lot of things that I certainly try to do. American Oracle is one. Especially in that book, he thinks a lot about tragedy and some of these other Southern writers and other writers of
Mhm.
the Civil War and how they thought about what it meant in a very dramatic sort of way.
Yeah.
And even in this book, Race and Reunion. It's a wonderful book, really about memory. It's an academic book. It's got a pretty clear argument to it. But every opening chapter is geared towards some sort of story, some sort of episode, some person,
Mhm.
some tension, some plot line. And that is sort of the essence of writing narrative. And so David was a really wonderful model for me to follow. And he is someone who this book could have never been written without him, in part because when I went to him to say that I want to do something like this, he slapped me on the back and said, "Go for it. Do what you want to do.
Great.
Write the book you want to write, and go for it." And
Yeah.
so a lot of credit to him.
Yeah, and certainly in American Oracle, David Blight also points out some of the hazards, in your way if you're going to write narrative history. Again, issues involving tragedy and stuff like that.
Hmm.
If he points out as Bruce Catton likes to look at the tragedy of the Civil War, and then other things that he could have looked at if he was writing differently
Hmm.
fall by the wayside because Bruce Catton wants to look at the tragedy of it.
Right.
I'm going to see if you have just a moment. I hope
Sure.
if we could go a little bit long because we have some comments. And if we haven't, I'm going to check for questions. But I also know that we have some friends that have been watching, and I want to shout out to them and give us a chance to respond. And certainly, David from Gurney is one of our favorite regulars, and he maintains a handle called Images of Abraham Lincoln. And so, thank you to David. Uh, our friends at Civil War Breakfast Club are watching,
Yeah.
and Darren Weeks from Civil War Breakfast Club says, "Buy this book. It's a very important read." Thank you,
If,
David, or thank you,
if I
Darren.
if I could just say, Bjorn, Darren's a very smart man.
He
And
recognizes important books.
and I did not pay him to say that. So
But should you choose to buy this book that Darren recommends, you could buy it from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop just by clicking on the link in the comments. And wherever you do buy it, let me say, please buy it from one of your independent booksellers. It's a great way to support local bookstores and local bookshops. And like I said, most of them love to do these book signings like we're doing right now. Perhaps you've had a chance to do one or two sit downs at a bookshop, Ben. I certainly hope so.
yeah, I've had a great tour. I've been a couple weeks on the road visiting different bookshops, mainly around the South, but I've been able to get up to Pennsylvania for a bit at the National Civil War History Museum for a talk. But I've been to Oxford, Mississippi, Spartanburg, South Carolina, People's Book in Washington D.C., and it's all been really great. Had a really good time. Got a little interrupted by some winter weather in the South, which is amazing.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, you never expect something to get snowed out in Charleston of all places. But no, it's been a really good couple weeks.
Excellent, excellent. Well, hey, Ben, congratulations on the publication of Somewhere Toward Freedom. Let's go back and take a look at it again. The book is Somewhere Toward Freedom, Sherman's March and the Story of America's Largest Emancipation. It comes to us from Simon and Schuster. The cost is $29.99. It's from Professor Bennett Parten. And do you have anything else for us, Ben, before we sign off today?
No, I just want to say it's been a real pleasure and privilege to be here, and I appreciate you having me on.
All right. Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you to everybody that has been watching. My name is Bjorn Skaptason. I am your host. You've been watching A House Divided, and we will see you here next time.